There are moments in history when a single human decision made in the space of a heartbeat determines whether hundreds of others live to see tomorrow. These moments do not come with fanfare, warning, or preparation. They arrive quietly, wrapped in danger, and they demand everything from the individuals who face them. Before we enter such a moment, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us, because stories like this one are not simply tales of war. They are reminders of courage, resilience, and extraordinary human determination that should never be forgotten. Now let us rise together into the thin, lethal air over Okinawa, where a young marine pilot made a choice no manual had ever taught and no engineer had ever imagined possible. At precisely 11:14 in the morning on May 10th in the year 1945, First Lieutenant Robert Klingman guided his F-4U Corsair into an altitude where the sky became pale and the world below seemed impossibly distant. He was 28 years old, yet the weight of 43 combat missions pressed upon his shoulders as heavily as the oxygen mask on his face. For 6 brutal weeks, he had flown daily out of Kadena Airfield, sometimes twice a day, sometimes more because the war over Okinawa demanded ceaseless vigilance. On this morning, the altimeter needle crept past 38,000 feet, a height 3,000 feet beyond the Corsair's rated ceiling. The air outside his cockpit was thin enough to weaken the body and distort the mind, a place so cold that metal groaned in protest and lubricants thickened to sludge. Ahead of him, a dark speck drifted like a shadow cast upon the sky, a Japanese Kawasaki Ki-45 known to American pilots simply as the Nick. It was not the presence of the aircraft that made Klingman push his machine beyond its limits, but the purpose it served. The Nick was not loaded with bombs or torpedoes. It flew not to attack but to see, and because it saw thousands of American sailors were dying. For days, these reconnaissance planes had swept above the American fleet, cruising at around 35,000 feet, where almost nothing could touch them. Anti-aircraft guns could not reach such altitude. Most fighters could not climb fast enough to intercept them before they vanished into Japanese airspace. They had the freedom to observe, to photograph, and to return home without consequence. Those photographs carried in their bodies were the true weapons. They revealed the exact position of American destroyers, carriers, transports, supply ships, and support vessels spread across the waters off Okinawa. They were delivered to Japanese commanders who plotted precise kamikaze attacks with chilling efficiency. In the days before Klingman took flight, kamikaze raids had sunk roughly a dozen ships and inflicted devastating wounds upon more than 300 others. The ocean churned with fire and oil, and the sky filled with smoke rising from warships that had not even seen the attackers coming. Every successful reconnaissance run meant another day of catastrophe, another day when sailors fought the sea itself to survive. Marine Fighter Squadron 312, the unit Klingman belonged to, had suffered deeply from these attacks. In April alone, 4 pilots were lost to kamikaze-related operations. Some had fallen defending the fleet. Others had been caught in the chaos of emergency scrambles. The constant tension that stretched over the pilots of Kadena was not the ordinary strain of combat. It was something heavier, something personal. They were defending men who relied on them completely. When a kamikaze hit a ship, every pilot felt the failure like a stab to the heart. And so when the radar station at Kadena reported a single inbound contact at 25,000 feet approaching from the north at a steady speed, 4 Corsairs rose at once to intercept it. They knew what it was, and they knew what capturing it meant. The flight launched at 9:40 in the morning under the leadership of Captain Kenneth Rouser. Klingman flew as his wingman, while Captain Jim Cox and Second Lieutenant Frank Watson formed the second pair behind them. Their assigned mission had been routine combat air patrol, a pattern flown so often that the motions seemed almost automatic. They were supposed to orbit at 13,000 feet, scan the sky, and respond if any threats approached. But nothing about May 10th was destined to be routine. When the radar call came at 10:37, announcing the high-altitude bogey, Rouser did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. He ordered his flight to climb at maximum power. All 4 pilots pulled up into the sky with engines roaring. The Corsair, driven by its massive Pratt & Whitney R2 800 engine, began to ascend with the powerful thrust that made the aircraft famous. Yet at such altitudes, even the Corsair needed help. Rouser ordered the entire flight to jettison their external fuel tanks, heavy canisters that provided range but hindered climbing. The tanks tumbled away like silver seeds falling from the belly of each fighter. Next came a command that every pilot understood, but none enjoyed following. Rauser ordered them to fire off their ammunition to lighten their aircraft further. Klingman obeyed instantly. He leveled his aircraft, pointed the nose toward empty ocean, and pressed the trigger. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns unleashed a furious storm of metal into the sea below their combined roar, filling the cockpit. For nearly a full minute he held the trigger, sending 2,000 rounds into the endless blue expanse beneath him. The ammunition represented nearly 700 pounds of weight, discarded not because it was useless, but because altitude mattered more. The others followed his lead. In less than 2 minutes, 12,000 rounds of ammunition rained harmlessly into the Pacific. Not a single shot struck an enemy, but every one of them helped the corsairs climb toward their prey. The higher they climbed, the more unforgiving the world became. At 20,000 feet, the engines began to labor. The superchargers screamed with the effort of compressing thin air. The temperature gauges edged closer to danger. The corsairs gained altitude, but they paid for it with stress, heat, and strain. Then at 22,000 feet, the first signs of trouble appeared. Cox's voice crackled over the radio, reporting rough engine performance. Moments later, Watson echoed the same complaint. Their engines struggled with the thin air, their temperatures climbed, and their oil pressures dropped uncomfortably. If they continued climbing, both aircraft risked catastrophic engine failure. Rauser faced a decision that carried weight far heavier than his aircraft. He needed to sacrifice 2 fighters to give 2 others a chance to stop the nick. He made the call without wavering. Cox and Watson were ordered to descend back toward the fleet, where the air was thicker and the strain on their engines would ease. The pursuit would continue with just Rauser and Klingman. Meanwhile, the Nick completed its second pass over the fleet. Its photographs were captured, its film was ready to return to Japan, and like the shadow of a coming storm, it turned north for home. The American pilots knew they had only minutes to catch it. Every mile the Nick gained was a mile closer to safety, and a mile closer to a deadly strike against American ships. Rauser and Klingman pushed their throttles forward until they struck the safety wires that prevented pilots from sliding into emergency war power by mistake. But this was no mistake. Both men broke the wires, deliberately pushing their engines into a zone where engineers had marked the limits of safety. Emergency war power was not meant to be used lightly. It produced immense thrust, but also immense heat. It strained the pistons, bearings, and cylinders past tolerances. The manuals warned that engines might survive 5 minutes in this mode, perhaps 10 in desperate circumstances. Rauser and Klingman needed far more than 10 minutes. The engines howled. The exhaust stacks glowed faintly. The oil in the lines thinned from heat. The corsairs clawed their way past 25,000 feet, finally catching sight of the Nick ahead of them. The Japanese crew, seeing the persistent shadows of 2 American fighters behind them, pressed their own aircraft to its limits. The Kawasaki climbed steadily toward 35,000 feet, aiming for an altitude where even the mighty Corsair would falter. At 30,000 feet, the Corsairs suffered the punishment of nature. The control surfaces grew soft and sluggish. Every movement of the stick required patience. A sharp turn could stall the entire aircraft. Recovery from such a stall in air so thin would be nearly impossible. Rauser and Klingman climbed anyway. They had no other choice. Every foot gained was a foot wrestled from gravity itself. The chase stretched into the sky like a desperate climb up a mountain with no summit. At 36,000 feet, the Corsairs reached their rated service ceiling, yet they did not stop. They continued, engines burning themselves alive, superchargers, shrieking gauges deep in the red. The pilots were now far beyond anything the aircraft had been built to endure. Engineers at Chance Vought had never imagined this scenario, never tested such limits, never prepared instructions for such altitude. Yet here the pilots were climbing, still driven by need and by duty. At last, at 38,000 feet, 3,000 feet above the Corsairs' official ceiling, Rauser and Klingman closed to within firing range. The Nick loomed ahead, a vulnerable but dangerous target. The Japanese rear gunner swiveled his Type 98 machine gun toward the approaching fighters. At this altitude, the slightest pull of the trigger meant the difference between life and death. Rauser fired first. His remaining rounds tore through the Knick's right engine, ripping open the cowling. Flames erupted as oil sprayed across hot metal. Black smoke streamed backward as the propeller faltered. The Knick slowed, wounded but not killed. Its remaining engine kept it in the air. Raus's guns ran dry. He pulled aside, trusting Klingman to finish the job. Klingman positioned himself 50 feet behind the Knick's tail, the perfect spot for a lethal burst. The Japanese gunner swung his weapon toward him and fired. Bullets tore into Klingman's right wing, ripping fabric and punching holes through metal. Klingman ignored them. He pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. He pressed again. Still nothing. At 38,000 feet, the cold had frozen his guns. The weapon he had protected so carefully by dumping ammunition earlier was now useless. The Knick began to pull away again, its wounded engine sputtering but alive. Klingman had climbed for 90 minutes, pushed his Corsair beyond every design limit, and was now mere seconds from losing the target entirely. And he had no guns. He had one choice left. The moment Klingman recognized that his guns had frozen was the moment when an ordinary mission became a struggle that defied every rule of aviation and survival. At 38,000 feet, where the air carried barely enough oxygen to keep the human body functioning, his mind worked with a clarity sharpened by urgency rather than fear. If he turned back now, the Knick would reach Japanese airspace within minutes. The reconnaissance photographs would be developed. The kamikaze planners would study them. And by the next dawn, American sailors would again fight for their lives under waves of suicide attacks directed with deadly precision. To retreat was not simply to lose an aircraft, it was to accept the deaths of men who depended upon him. He considered the possibility of ramming the Japanese aircraft, directly slamming his Corsair into the fuselage of the Knick, and ensuring both planes fell together into the Pacific. It was an option available to him just as it had been to the kamikaze pilots, whose devastating attacks defined the Okinawa campaign, but such a strike would end his life instantly. It would leave no room for survival, and it was not the American way. Klingman sought a solution that fulfilled the mission without becoming a suicide attacker himself. The idea formed quickly, intuitively, like a spark leaping across a gap. His propeller. A 4-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller, 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter, spun before him at roughly 2,000 revolutions per minute. At such speed, the blade tips traveled near the boundary of the sound barrier. They were not merely mechanical components. They were cutting instruments propelled by an engine desperate to survive. If he could position the propeller just right, he might slice through the Knick's tail, severing the vertical stabilizer and rendering the aircraft uncontrollable. A blow to the fuselage would destroy both planes, but a blow to the tail precisely delivered could cripple only the enemy aircraft while giving the Corsair a chance to escape. Klingman made his decision without hesitation. He advanced his throttle to maximum and climbed above the Knick. Captain Rauser, realizing what Klingman intended, shifted to the flank to draw the rear gunner's attention. The air grew even thinner as Klingman rose another 200 feet above the Japanese aircraft. The Corsair trembled from strain as if protesting the impossible altitude and the brutal demands placed upon its engine. Klingman leveled, eased his stick forward and began his dive toward the enemy. The Japanese gunner, alerted by the sudden change in positioning, swung his machine gun upward. Muzzle flashes sparkled like grains of fire in the thin light of the upper sky. Bullets hammered Klingman's right wing, ripping fresh wounds in the fabric. Metal struck metal with the hollow clatter of desperation. He held his path regardless. The Knick's tail grew larger in his windscreen. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. Then metal met metal. The shriek was not the sound of machines, but the sound of violence itself. The Corsair's propeller blades chewed through the Knick's rudder, tearing aluminum into fragments that scattered in tumbling arcs. The impact cracked Klingman's windscreen, sending spiderweb fissures across the glass. The Knick shuddered violently but remained airborne. The tail fin had been wounded, bent, dented, partially mangled, but it had not been severed completely. Klingman pulled back on his stick. The Corsair staggered upward, but the vibration was now vicious. One of the propeller blades had bent on impact. The imbalance sent tremors through the engine, the wings, the cockpit, and even through Klingman's bones. The gauges blurred from shaking. The cylinder head temperature needle buried itself deep in the red. The engine fought to maintain life despite the assault it had endured. Klingman knew he had no time. The wounded Nick, though damaged, still flew with grim determination. If it reached Japanese territory, the disaster would be complete. There was no time to reconsider, no time to descend, no time to regroup. He maneuvered again into position. His second attack run was aimed at the rear cockpit. The Japanese gunner remained the greatest threat, and removing him could make the third strike easier. Klingman climbed above the Nick once more, though each foot upward felt like lifting the weight of the entire sky. He nosed the Corsair down sharply. The damaged propeller screamed as it cut the thin air. Vibrations spread through the airframe like a living force. Klingman forced his eyes to remain steady on the rear canopy. He saw the gunner's face. Young, perhaps barely 20 years old, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The gunner had just enough time to look directly into the diving Corsair before the spinning propeller struck. The canopy shattered into shards. Metal crumpled. The machine gun mount tore from its base. The gunner and his weapon were flung into the slipstream at nearly 300 miles per hour, disappearing instantly into the boundless sky. The Nick continued flying. Its left engine still provided enough power to keep it aloft. The second blow had removed its defense but had not yet ended its mission. Klingman felt the controls growing heavier. He looked forward and could see two of his propeller blades bent nearly backward toward the cowling. Another blade was missing a segment from its tip. The fourth blade was cracked along its length. The engine, still running at emergency power, groaned, rattled, and threatened to fail at any second. But he still had one more chance. He climbed once more, fighting both the machine and the physics that tried to pull him from the sky. Every vibration felt like a blow from inside the engine. Every tremor warned of impending failure. But Klingman did not stop. He reached the altitude needed, then rolled the Corsair forward into a steep, committed dive directly toward the Nick's tail, this time aiming for the exact base where the tail assembly met the fuselage. The dive felt like falling through a collapsing world. The air screamed past the damaged propeller. The Japanese pilot attempted a maneuver, but with one engine gone and the tail wounded, there was little he could do. The Corsair descended like a hammer. When the propeller struck, the sound was catastrophic yet final. Aluminum tore rivets burst and the entire tail assembly wrenched free from the fuselage. The Nick pitched instantly forward, entering a violent tumble. Parts of the aircraft broke away. The fuselage spun helplessly toward the distant ocean 15,000 feet below. No parachutes appeared. The reconnaissance photographs, so dangerous to the fleet, remained trapped inside the falling wreck. The mission was complete. Then Klingman's own crisis began. The moment after the final strike, the Corsair lurched into a spin unlike any he had ever experienced. The ruined propeller blades created uneven drag. With the engine shaking itself to pieces, the aircraft rolled into a clockwise spiral. The horizon rotated. Sky, ocean, the cockpit blurred. Gravity grabbed him from every angle, pulling at his limbs and fogging the edges of his vision. Standard spin recovery procedures were useless. A damaged propeller did not behave like a functional one. Its aerodynamic forces were unpredictable, violent, and asymmetrical. Klingman needed to improvise. He pulled the throttle to idle. The propeller slowed, then stopped windmilling. The imbalance reduced slightly. He forced his feet hard against the opposite rudder. The spin slowed but continued. He pushed the control stick forward, letting the nose drop to gain airspeed. The controls regained some responsiveness. The spiral became less violent. At 36,000 feet, he wrestled the aircraft into a controllable descending turn. At 34,000 feet, he achieved level flight. The Corsair, though alive, was mortally wounded. The propeller hung on the engine shaft like a twisted, broken fan. Two blades bent backward, one blade cracked and missing part of its tip. The engine was boiling with heat temperature gauges deep in the danger zone. Oil pressure read 0. A thin haze of smoke drifted from the cowling. The aircraft was thousands of feet above the Pacific, with a silent engine, no fuel remaining, and 70 miles of ocean and land between him and Kadena. Still, Klingman pointed the nose south and began the long, powerless glide toward home. The glide toward Okinawa was not a descent. It was a negotiation with physics' fate and the fragile remains of an airframe that had endured more punishment in 1 hour than most aircraft suffered in their entire service lives. At 34,000 feet, Klingman trimmed the Corsair, carefully measuring every movement with the precision of a surgeon working in darkness. The propeller, destroyed and useless, no longer turned, and its rigid, misshapen blades created unpredictable drag. The aircraft did not glide like a fighter, sleek and swift. It glided like a broken instrument carried by thin currents of air. Captain Rausser, whose aircraft remained fully functional, formed up on Klingman's wing. Though regulations allowed him to return immediately to confirm the kill, he refused to abandon his wingman. Instead, he stayed silently, matching Klingman's descent, understanding that the man beside him had just risked his life in a way no manual or training program had ever imagined. The bond between pilots was rarely spoken aloud, but it was unbreakable. Rausser would stay with Klingman until the end, whatever the end happened to be. At 20,000 feet, Klingman assessed the situation with the calmness of a man who had survived too many close moments to panic now. The fuel gauges were empty. Not low empty. Every internal tank, every reserve tank, every auxiliary tank had been drained during the 90-minute climb and the prolonged emergency power runs. Oil pressure registered 0, the result of seals ruptured by heat during the pursuit. The engine, silent now, would never turn again. Even if a miracle of fuel appeared, the R2800 radial was a dead weight, burned, scored, and internally ruined. Klingman checked his glide ratio. The Corsair, under perfect conditions, could glide approximately 12-1, meaning 12 feet of forward travel for every 1 foot of altitude lost. But these were not perfect conditions. The deformed propeller produced drag with every shift of the wind. The airframe, stressed to its limits, resisted the smooth airflow that efficient gliding required. Still, his altitude was high, and Okinawa lay roughly 70 miles away. If he preserved every foot of altitude and avoided unnecessary maneuvers, he might just make it. Below the Pacific stretched endlessly a shimmering field of deep blue, broken only by the distant outline of land. The island of Okinawa appeared gradually green fields, brown earth, and finally the thin shape of Kadena Airfield. It was still impossibly far, but it was visible, and visibility meant hope. Rausser broke radio silence long enough to notify Kadena Tower. His voice carried the weight of urgency. 1 Corsair inbound, no engine power, severely damaged propeller. Emergency priority requested. Kadena Tower acknowledged instantly. Crash crews rolled from their shelters. Fire trucks positioned along the runway. Ambulances prepared to receive whatever remained of the pilot who had attempted the impossible above the Pacific. At 15,000 feet, Klingman continued adjusting his glide path, compensating for shifting winds. Air currents flowed unpredictably across the island. An eastern wind pushed him westward. A northern gust corrected his drift. He analyzed the environment with the precision of a man who knew that one miscalculation would end in the ocean short of the runway. Landing in the water was not survivable in his state. With a dead engine and a warped propeller, ditching was almost certainly fatal. His only chance was the grey strip of concrete that lay miles ahead, 10,000 feet. Klingman lowered the landing gear manually. The hydraulic system had retained just enough pressure for a single operation. The nose wheel dropped and locked with a green indicator light. The right main gear dropped and locked, but the left gear hesitated. It extended halfway and stuck. The indicator glowed red with stubborn defiance. Klingman cycled the gear handle up and down. Nothing changed. He tried again. The left wheel refused to cooperate. Landing with 1 locked wheel and 1 partially extended wheel was a recipe for disaster. On touchdown, the aircraft would jerk violently toward the left. If the gear collapsed, the wing would strike the ground. The Corsair, heavy even in a glide, would cartwheel, tearing itself apart, its fuel residue igniting its remains, scattering across the runway. 5,000 feet. He adjusted his glide again. The shift in wind reduced his range by a narrow margin, tightening the already razor-thin line between success and catastrophe. He recalculated. He would reach the threshold, but with very little altitude to spare. 2,000 feet. He could now see the crash trucks lining the runway. Their engines idled. Fire crews stood ready with hoses and extinguishers. Medics watched with silent tension. Everyone at Kadena understood the danger. Aircraft that landed without power and without fully extended gear rarely survived the attempt. 1,000 feet. Klingman aligned his approach precisely with the runway centerline. The Corsair descended smoothly without any turbulence. The air was mercifully calm, though the broken propeller remained a constant threat, twisting the airflow unpredictably. Klingman held the control stick steady, guiding the powerless aircraft toward the concrete. 500 feet. The Corsair was slightly high. A powered aircraft could correct altitude easily with throttle, but Klingman had no such luxury. Instead, he slipped the aircraft banking slightly to expose more surface area to the airflow and lose precious altitude quickly. The damaged propeller caught the wind, strangely tilting the nose. Klingman countered instantly with rudder straightening the fuselage. 200 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath him. The Corsair floated over it like a wounded bird desperate for rest. 100 feet. He held the glide at 85 knots, trimming the aircraft for a gentle flare. 50 feet. The tail was low. The nose was level. The gear indicators glowed green, stubborn red. 20 feet. Klingman pulled back slightly on the stick. The nose lifted. The Corsair descended the last few yards. The nose wheel touched first, a soft kiss of rubber against concrete. Then the right main gear settled onto the runway. The left gear hit last. The indicator remained red, but the wheel held. The aircraft rolled forward steadily. Klingman stood on the brakes. Without engine thrust, without the drag of a rotating propeller, the Corsair relied solely on brakes and friction to slow. 2,800 feet remaining. The tires smoked. The aircraft shuddered. 2,400 feet remaining. Rausser paced him, flying alongside at low altitude. 2,000 feet remaining. Klingman pumped the brakes, feeling the Corsair strain against momentum. 1,000 feet remaining. Crash crews raced beside the aircraft, ready for the moment the gear collapsed. 600 feet, 400 feet, 200 feet. The Corsair rolled to a stop with just over 300 feet of runway remaining. Silence filled the cockpit. The engines of nearby trucks rumbled, but inside the Corsair there was only breath sweat and the stunned awareness of survival. Klingman reached forward and shut down what systems remained. His hands trembled uncontrollably, a delayed response to the 2-hour battle against altitude machinery and death. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They stared at the mangled propeller, its twisted blades bent like broken clock hands frozen in time. 6 inches of one blade were missing. 2 blades touched the cowling. The 4th blade was cracked along its length. Bullet holes cratered the right wing. Oil coated the engine housing. The Corsair looked less like an aircraft and more like a survivor pulled from the jaws of destruction. A master sergeant, a veteran of more than 2 decades who had seen aircraft torn apart from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, walked slowly around the Corsair. He traced the damage with his eyes, inspected the engine, checked the landing gear, studied the wing routes. When he completed his circuit, his conclusion was immediate and final. The aircraft was a total loss. The engine was ruined. The propeller was destroyed. The airframe carried stress fractures throughout. The Corsair that had killed the Nick would never fly again. It would be stripped for any salvageable parts, and the rest would be scrapped. But Klingman had completed the mission. He had denied the enemy its reconnaissance photographs. He had prevented another wave of precision-guided kamikaze strikes. He had returned alive from the edge of the sky. And his story was only beginning to be written. Intelligence officers arrived almost immediately as regulations demanded. Pilot accounts had to be recorded within hours of combat, while details were still sharp and unclouded by fatigue. Klingman sat before them, still trembling from the strain of the flight, but alert and precise in his descriptions. He recounted the 90-minute climb beyond 38,000 feet, the frozen guns that had forced improvisation, the 3 propeller strikes, the severed tail, the fall of the Nick with its reconnaissance film, and the violent spin that followed. He noted the temperature at altitude, the speed of the Nick, the weapon configuration of the Japanese crew, and the exact sequence of events that had led him to use his aircraft as a weapon. Rausser corroborated every detail. With his eyewitness account, the kill was confirmed as official one, Kawasaki Ki 45. Nick destroyed, no survivors, no reconnaissance data transmitted. The mission had succeeded under circumstances no training scenario had ever imagined. 2 days later, as if the sky wished to test him again, Klingman flew a routine mission in another Corsair when the aircraft suffered hydraulic failure. This time he could not lower the landing gear. At 5,000 feet over the ocean, he made the decision to bail out. His parachute blossomed into the wind, slowing his fall into the Pacific. A destroyer reached him after 30 minutes in the water, pulling him aboard cold but alive. By the next day he was back at Kadena, taking the sky again because the war did not pause for rest or recovery. By the time Okinawa was declared secure on June 22nd, Klingman had flown 78 combat missions. None would equal the ferocity, altitude, or historical weight of the May 10th interception, but each flight added another thread to the tapestry of his wartime experience. His squadron would remember that day as the moment when one man stretched both himself and his aircraft beyond the breaking point and returned victorious against impossible odds. In July, the Navy Cross was awarded to him, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. The citation described his extraordinary heroism, his disregard for personal safety, and his innovation under extreme duress. It documented that he had pursued an enemy aircraft beyond the performance limits of his own fighter, improvised a weapon when his guns failed, and prevented reconnaissance data from reaching Japanese commanders, thereby likely saving countless American lives. The medal acknowledged everything he had risked and everything he had preserved. Yet even as the war neared its end, Klingman's life story had begun long before the climb above Okinawa, shaped by hardship and perseverance. Born on January 12 in 1917 in the small town of Binger, Oklahoma, he was one of 9 children in a family struggling through the Great Depression. Opportunities were scarce. Work was harder to find than hope. When he was 17, his parents sent him to Fort Sill for civilian military training, not because of ambition, but because the government program provided food and clothing for 30 days. But in those weeks, he discovered discipline, purpose, and direction. When he returned home, he carried more than nourishment. He carried a vision of service. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in August 1934. After basic training at Paris Island, he was assigned to Marine Barracks, Washington District of Columbia, where he served as a ceremonial drummer. For 4 years, he sent much of his pay back home to support his family. When he was discharged in 1938, he attempted to build a civilian life, opening a small burger cafe. But business during the Depression barely survived, and hope again seemed fragile. His older brother encouraged him to join the Navy for better pay and broader opportunity. Klingman listened. He enlisted in 1940 and reported to the battleship USS Tennessee as an aircraft maintenance mechanic. He advanced quickly to first class, proving himself reliable and skilled. But his timing intersected with history in the harshest way. On December 7th in 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. USS Tennessee took 2 bomb hits while Klingman was ashore completing carrier training in San Diego. When he returned, he found his ship wounded but afloat. The nation was at war. In 1942, he completed carrier qualification and was discharged from active service to join the Navy's Aviation Cadet Program. He was 25 years old, older than most candidates who entered the program at 19 or 20, but he excelled. He graduated in the top 10% of his pre-flight class and continued to succeed at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. When he received his commission and became a Marine second lieutenant, he transitioned to training on the newly introduced F-4U Corsair. The aircraft was powerful, challenging, and demanding, but it suited him. When Marine Fighter Squadron 312 deployed to the Pacific in March 1945, Klingman was among them. The Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, had begun in early April. More than 12,000 American servicemen would die. Japanese casualties would reach 77,000. Civilians on the island would suffer unthinkably, with an estimated 150,000 lives lost. In the skies, kamikaze attacks became the most feared threat to the fleet. A single Zero fighter carrying a 500-pound bomb became a guided missile when hurled into an American destroyer or carrier deck. Conventional evasive tactics offered little protection, and the psychological weight of the attacks pressed heavily upon every pilot. Amid this devastation, the reconnaissance missions of the NIC enabled Japan to deliver targeted, coordinated suicide strikes. Daily photographic runs allowed enemy commanders to assign specific ships as priority targets, destroyers at one set of coordinates, carriers at another. Without such intelligence, attacks became chaotic and less effective. With such intelligence, kamikaze pilots became almost impossibly accurate. The American fleet knew that stopping a nick meant breaking the chain that led from surveillance to destruction. That was why Clingman climbed. That was why he risked an aircraft and a life. That was why, in the moment when his guns froze, he refused to abandon the mission. After the war, Clingman did not leave the service. The Marine Corps needed experienced aviators in the uncertain world that followed victory. He continued to train younger pilots, passing on not only technical knowledge, but the deep sense of responsibility that combat had etched into him. When war erupted in Korea in June 1950, Clingman deployed again, this time not as a fighter pilot, but as a forward air controller with the 1st Marine Division. He marked targets under fire, guided airstrikes with precision, and saved lives daily through his accuracy and calm judgment. He served 13 months on the Korean peninsula and earned another air medal for his work. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, Clingman continued to serve, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. His career, spanning 32 years from 1934 to 1966, bridged an era in American military history that stretched from the depths of the Great Depression to the dawn of the Cold War. When he retired at 49 years old, he had served with distinction in 2 wars, trained dozens of younger aviators, and lived through experiences that shaped him forever. He settled in Kihei, Maui with his wife, whose name happened to be Jackie Cochran, though not the famous aviator of the same name. The parachute that had saved him during the bailout on May 12th became the fabric of her wedding dress, a quiet symbol of survival and love woven into the start of their life together. Even in retirement, Clingman continued to fly, earning his private pilot's license and guiding small civilian aircraft around the Hawaiian Islands with the same passion he had carried since his youth. He rarely spoke in detail about the mission on May 10th. His family knew the outlines, Frozen Gun's propeller, strike Navy Cross, but he did not embellish the story. Like many veterans, he carried his memories quietly, believing that he had simply fulfilled his duty. The full account of his actions emerged gradually through historical records, witness statements, and military documentation. Robert Clingman passed away on July 6th in the year 2004 at 87 years old, leaving behind his wife, children, grandchildren, and a legacy of courage that stretched far beyond a single mission. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His gravestone listed his decorations: Navy Cross Distinguished, Flying Cross Air Medal with Gold Star. Yet those words etched in stone could never entirely capture the magnitude of what he had done. The mission on May 10th stands alone in aviation history. No other pilot deliberately used a propeller as a precision-cutting weapon at extreme altitude and lived to tell the tale. Some pilots rammed enemy aircraft during the war, but those collisions were catastrophic and often fatal. Clingman performed 3 controlled strikes at 38,000 feet, destroyed the tail of a reconnaissance plane, regained control of a crippled fighter, glided across 70 miles of open ocean, and landed on a 3,006 100-foot runway with no engine power and partially extended landing gear. He survived. He flew again. He lived almost 6 more decades. His actions proved that human determination can push machines past their limits, that improvisation can overcome failure, that one pilot driven by duty and courage can prevent the deaths of countless others, and that the stories of such men deserve to be told, remembered, and honored. Clingman's legacy does not rest solely in medals or missions. It rests in the lives he protected, the pilots he trained, the battles he helped shape, and the history his courage preserved. His name carved into the granite at Arlington stands as a reminder that even in the vast, violent sky of war, there were individuals who defied the impossible, and because of them, others lived.